I want you to think back to a moment, and um, this could be from yesterday or it could be from like 10 years ago when you found yourself just completely swept up in the undeniable energy of a crowd.
Yeah.
Maybe you were in a stadium or, at a protest. Or maybe it wasn't a physical crowd at all. Maybe it was just a sudden electric wave of national panic that you felt through a screen, or just that endless hypnotic scroll of digital outrage on your phone.
Right. We've all been there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in that moment, you felt the anger, the fear, or maybe this like really profound, intense sense of belonging tightening in your chest. But I want to ask you a very strange, very unsettling question. Did those feelings truly originate within you? Or did you walk into an invisible architecture that was specifically designed to harvest your attention and basically render those emotions through your body?
It is a profoundly uncomfortable question to sit with, honestly. And the reason it's uncomfortable is because we hold on to this core belief that we are completely sovereign individuals. We tell ourselves that, our emotions are generated from our own internal authentic state and that our beliefs are the result of purely rational choices.
Right. I chose to be angry about this.
Exactly. But if you begin to study the mechanics of collective human behavior, you have to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the environment itself, the very social and digital air you breathe, is actually coded to make you feel a certain way before your conscious mind even has a chance to process what's happening?
Today, we're pulling apart a concept that completely shifted how I look at my own habits, my reactions, and, honestly, my entire perception of reality. We are doing a comprehensive, deeply reflective deep dive into a book called Jinn and Egregores, The Hidden Architecture of Spiritual Control, Symbolic Power, and Human Capture by an author known as M.S.R.
It's quite a title.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear about our mission here. This isn't just a quick skim of, abstract mysticism. We are going to treat this material with the intellectual rigor it demands. We're looking at a tactical, mechanical breakdown of how human perception is captured, and more importantly, how a person might actually recover their clarity, their conscience, and a direct relationship with the divine in an age completely saturated by invisible systems of control.
Yeah. And the foundational argument of M.S.R's work establishes that modern life is not merely governed by the visible institutions we endlessly debate.
Like politics and economics.
Right. We think the world is run by economic systems, political parties, media conglomerates. But the author argues that these visible structures are just the physical scaffolding for much larger, invisible, engineered atmospheres. And these atmospheres are called egregores. Furthermore, the book posits a deeply challenging metaphysical claim. It says these fields are not always accidental. They're often engineered and managed by a much older, non-human, fire-born order of intelligences known in various traditions, but specifically in Islamic theology as the Jinn.
The Jinn.
Yeah. And they don't govern by kicking down your door. They govern through indirect rule.
Right.
Basically, they build the climate, and you alter your behavior to survive the weather.
To survive a system of capture, you first have to know what you are looking at. So we need to build our vocabulary, and that starts with the first 3 chapters, the ontogeny of these fields. So chapter 1, what is an egregore? We hear terms like culture or zeitgeist or ideology all the time.
Sure.
But M.S.R. is talking about something with much more mechanical reality. So break this down for me. What exactly separates an egregore from just a general public mood?
Well, it's crucial to define what an egregore is not before we understand what it is. The author warns against 2 extremes. First, you cannot treat an egregore like a literal cartoonish demon walking around in invisible clothes, because that strips the concept of its subtle, systemic reality.
It's not a ghost haunting a hallway.
Exactly. But on the other extreme, if you reduce an egregore to just a sociological buzzword, a dry synonym for groupthink or ideology, you strip it of its metaphysical weight.
Okay, so what is it then?
The book defines an egregore as a patterned field formed by the convergence of human thought, emotion, symbol, and ritual. When enough human beings invest a specific emotional or traumatic charge into a shared symbol or narrative, a localized field stabilizes.
It condenses.
Yes, it condenses. And once it reaches a certain density, it becomes an autonomous atmospheric force that exerts behavioral pressure back downward onto the human hosts who created it.
I really want to visualize this because, if I walk across a grassy field once, nothing happens.
Right.
But if 1,000 people walk across that same grassy field, a path is worn into the dirt. Is an egregore just a social path worn by habit? Or is it a pre-seeded template, like an invisible trench that was dug specifically so we would fall into it?
That distinction lies right at the heart of the book's taxonomy. A small, hyper-local egregore, say, the shared anxiety of a dysfunctional workplace, might form organically, much like that path worn in the grass.
Just from people repeating a stressful pattern.
Exactly. The repetition of stress creates a micro-atmosphere. But when we look at apex egregores empires, global financial systems, mass technological architectures, the book argues these behave exactly like preceded templates.
Okay.
They are intricately designed attractors waiting for compatible human charge. And this requires us to understand M.S.R's definition of humanity, which is discussed as we move into Chapter 2. The text refers to humans as biosymbolic field creatures.
Let's unpack that. Biosymbolic field creatures. I mean, that sounds like heavy academic jargon, meaning we aren't just biological bodies, we are creatures that run on meaning and symbols. Like a computer runs on code, our biology runs on symbols. Is that what we're getting at?
Precisely. Think about it. A dog doesn't look at a patterned piece of cloth on a pole and feel a sudden biological willingness to die for it.
A flag, yeah.
But a human does. We are intensely vulnerable to symbols because we are designed to seek meaning. And this vulnerability is exactly what the engineers of these macro fields exploit.
Which brings us to the engineers themselves. The book introduces the Jinn. Now, for a lot of people in the West, that word instantly conjures up, the wish-granting genie from a brass lamp.
Right, Robin Williams and Aladdin.
Exactly. But M.S.R. presents a completely different, much more terrifying ontological category. These are not genies. They are described as a pre-Adamic, fire-born class of man.
The distinction the author draws here between the fire-born jinn and the clay-born human, the Adamite, is central to the mechanics of this capture. Humans, made of clay, are described as being endowed with the roof, which is the divine spark or the breath of God.
Okay, the roof.
Yeah. Because of this spark, humans have the capacity for true vertical reference. We can generate genuine spiritual meaning. The jinn, on the other hand, originating from smokeless fire, lack this specific divine spark.
So they can't generate it themselves.
Exactly. They are native to the atmosphere, to subtlety, and to imitation, but they cannot generate that raw, foundational spiritual charge.
So if they lack the spark, but they want the power, they have to farm it.
That is the core of it. They must harvest it from us. The Jinnic intelligence builds the egregore, the software program, and human beings act as the biological hardware that renders it into reality. It is a system of indirect rule.
That's a great way to put it.
An invisible intelligence doesn't need to whisper to a million individual people if it can simply construct an atmospheric enclosure, like a culture of fear or a culture of obsessive consumption that a million people willingly breathe.
But that raises an obvious question, which leads us to Chapter 3. If we are surrounded by these massive fields of influence, if our attention is constantly being harvested by invisible architectures, why do we walk around completely oblivious to it?
That's a great question.
The author outlines a few specific blinders of modernity, and the first one that really hit me was secular reductionism.
Oh, secular reductionism is the ultimate camouflage for these fields. We've been trained over the last few centuries to flatten anything metaphysical into mere chemistry or sociology.
Right.
If an emotion or a mass panic can't be quantified under a microscope, we dismiss it as just a quirk of human nature. We've completely lost the vocabulary for the unseen.
And the second blinder the book points to is the sheer speed of modern mediated life.
The attention economy.
Yes, our attention is so incredibly fragmented by notifications, breaking news, and endless scrolling that we only ever react to immediate data points. We never sit still long enough to observe the actual climate that is linking those data points together.
And that ties perfectly into the third blinder M.S.R. discusses, which is irony. We use cynicism as a shield.
Oh, I see this all the time.
Yeah.
I think about people making self-aware memes about how addicted they are to a platform like TikTok or Twitter.
Right, doom scrolling.
Yeah, doom scrolling. They think that because they are making fun of their own addiction, because they are participating ironically, they are somehow immune to the capture.
Such a trap.
But the author's argument implies that the algorithm doesn't care if you're laughing. It doesn't care if you're cynical. It just wants your screen time.
It only requires your engagement. The system is entirely indifferent to your internal rationalizations. Whether you are participating out of genuine devotion or sarcastic irony, your nervous system is still tethered to the field.
The battery is still plugged in.
Exactly. The charge is still being harvested, and the machine code is still running.
Let's dig into that machine code, because moving into Section 2, Chapters 4 and 5, this is where the book shifts from philosophy into a very tactical breakdown. How does an egregore actually deploy and capture a population?
It's very methodical.
Right, M.S.R doesn't just say it happens magically. The book outlines a highly specific 9-stage life cycle of egregoric deployment. And I want us to walk through exactly how this mechanical process plays out in the real world.
Okay, the life cycle begins with reconnaissance. An egregoric intelligence, or the human proxies managing the system, first has to read the host's vulnerabilities. They scan for open wounds.
Wait, how does an invisible atmosphere or a social system read wounds?
Think about the modern data economy. Algorithms are constantly tracking your scroll pauses, your biometric reactions, the specific words that cause you to linger on a post.
Right, they map your behavior.
Exactly. On a macro level, after a societal trauma like an economic crash or a terrorist attack, there is a collective open wound. The reconnaissance phase identifies the exact frequency of fear or outrage the population is emitting.
Okay, so once that is mapped, what's next?
The system moves to stage 2, specification. This is where the desired behavioral output is defined. The system determines exactly what it wants the captured population to do.
Whether that is buying a specific product, hating a specific demographic, or voting a certain way.
Yes, so it's not just blind chaos, it's goal-oriented.
Which leads to the third stage, symbolic encoding. This is where they pack that specified intention into a recognizable sign, like a hashtag, a flag, a corporate logo, or a political slogan.
Yes, and before that symbol is unleashed globally, we hit stage 4, prototyping. The field pattern is tested in smaller, controlled environments.
Like a beta test.
Precisely.
Ugh.
Historically, this might have been an initiatory cult or a secret society. Today, it might be a specific online forum, a fringe political group, or a curated subculture. The system observes if the symbol effectively commands the desired behavior.
And if it works, we reach stage 5, release.
The moment it goes viral.
It breaches the containment and enters the mainstream bloodstream. And the immediate goal of the release is stage 6, which is synchrony.
Synchrony is the engine of the egregore. The field needs everyone to align their emotional charge at the exact same time. It's everyone posting the same black square on Instagram, or everyone chanting the same phrase at a rally, or everyone panic buying the exact same product on the same day.
The toilet paper rush of 2020.
Perfect example. This mass synchronization grants the invisible field immense density. It moves from being an idea to being a physical pressure in the room.
And to keep that pressure, the system moves to stage 7, reinforcement. The field teaches the hosts to self-police. You don't need a dictator punishing dissenters if the crowd will gleefully cancel, ostracize, or destroy anyone who steps out of the synchronized rhythm.
The egregore turns its victims into its immune system.
That is so dark.
It is, but it ensures the field survives long enough to reach stage 8, mutation. A rigid system will eventually break when the environment changes, so the egregore sheds its old skin.
A political movement might rebrand, or a corporation changes its logo.
Or a social media platform alters its interface. The aesthetic changes, but the underlying machine code, the capture of attention, remains identical. Finally, we arrive at stage 9, inheritance.
The ultimate victory for the field.
The construct becomes so deeply normalized that the next generation is born into it and simply calls it culture. They don't see the cage because they think it's just the shape of the world.
Wow. Okay, so we move into chapter 6 and 7. If symbols are the vessels used during that encoding phase, how do they actually hold power? The text argues that symbols are not just decorative art. It treats them as storage devices.
Yes, they are batteries. M.S.R argues that a symbol is packed with accumulated human charge. Think of a controversial political flag or an infamous religious icon. The cloth itself, or the geometry of the lines, has no inherent power.
It's just shapes and colors.
Exactly. But millions of human beings have poured their reverence, their blood, their terror, and their hatred into that specific geometric shape over centuries.
So the egregoric field is vast and distributed, but the symbol is the clickable icon on your mental desktop.
That's a brilliant way to put it. When you look at that symbol, it opens the entire program. It executes a massive downloaded archive of emotional history directly into your nervous system in a fraction of a second.
That makes sense on a micro level, but a battery loses its charge over time if you don't plug it in. If a symbol is holding all this emotional energy, how does the system keep the battery from dying?
It needs a charger.
Right. And chapters 8 and 9 argue that ritual is the charger.
Ritual is the circulatory system of the egregore, and we have to completely discard this outdated notion that rituals only happen in ancient temples with people wearing robes and burning incense.
Right. It's not always a movie scene.
M.S.R introduces the concept of microliturgies. A liturgy is just a prescribed public worship. Today, your morning smartphone scroll, the way you wake up, reach for the glowing rectangle, and swipe through the curated feed before you even speak to your family, is a deeply entrenched microliturgy.
The breaking news cycle is a liturgy. The synchronized outrage loop on social media where, a target is identified, the crowd is instructed to express performative anger for 48 hours, and then instructed to forget it and move to the next target. That is a highly structured, mathematical precise ritual.
And those microliturgies train your nervous system. They instruct your body exactly when to fear, when to mourn, and when to consume.
And when millions of people engage in these synchronized rituals, the crowd acts as a live diagnostic surface for the unseen engineer. The Jinnic intelligence can basically observe the crowd to see if the coding worked, if the emotional harvest was successful.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on this a little bit as we move into chapters 10 and 11. If we have free will and we have logical brains, why do we let the code in? If these fields are parasitic, shouldn't our natural psychological immune systems reject them? Why do we surrender our sovereignty so easily?
That is probably the most tragic mechanic detailed in the book. The key that unlocks the human host is trauma.
Trauma.
M.S.R argues that trauma creates structural porosity. When a human psyche, or on a macro scale, an entire civilization is fractured by profound fear, shock, violence, or sudden instability, it cannot defend its borders. The inward house is breached, the walls come down.
And into that breach rushes the egregore.
Yes. When you are terrified and disoriented, the egregore offers immediate artificial coherence. It provides a crystal-clear narrative, a highly visible enemy to blame, and a ritual of repair. It wraps itself around the wound like a bandage.
But it doesn't actually heal it.
No, the insidious reality is that it has no intention of healing the wound. Healing would mean the egregore loses its access point. Instead, it preserves the trauma as an unclosed loop. It turns your injury into a perpetual energy source, constantly agitating the wound just enough to keep you tethered to the system for relief.
It's a completely parasitic relationship.
Yeah.
And the book notes that this diffuse civilizational process of trauma capture is actually intentionally mirrored and compressed by practitioners of the occult. When the book discusses occult sigils and grimoires, it frames them not as fantasy magic, but as operative circuitry.
If a public symbol, like a national flag, is a massive, clumsy power station governing macro atmospheres, a sigil is a highly concentrated, microscopic circuit board. Occult systems use geometry, intense secrecy, and restricted knowledge to route very specific emotional currents with technical precision.
The how? The secrecy itself.
Acts as a pressure cooker. It intensifies the emotional charge because it isolates the participants from the neutralizing effects of the outside world.
Wait, how does a geometric shape actually route an emotion? Walk me through the mechanics of that.
Well, in the framework of the text, the mind is a landscape of associations. A sigil is constructed by taking a complex desire or intention, stripping away the linguistic baggage, and compressing it into a single abstract visual focal point.
Because words are too analytical.
Exactly. By bypassing the critical, analytical part of the brain, which works in words, the geometric shape embeds directly into the subconscious. The practitioner stares at it during a state of high emotional arousal or exhaustion, a manufactured microtrauma, creating a direct, unfiltered conduit between the raw emotion and the symbolic shape.
The shape becomes a tuning fork that continually hums with that specific frequency of intent.
Exactly.
And moving into section 3, chapters 12 and 13, the book argues that this compression of intent doesn't just stay on a piece of parchment, it scales up. It bleeds into the ambient environment, manipulating time, space, and human consciousness. We see this when M.S.R explores numerology, timing, and astrology.
The system uses these to create what the author calls counterfeit alignment.
Counterfeit alignment.
When an engineered egregoric operation like a war, a massive financial reset, or a political revolution is deliberately timed to align with specific numerological dates or astrological transits, it achieves something incredibly manipulative. It gives engineered human choices the aesthetic feeling of cosmic sanction.
It makes a boardroom decision feel like inescapable destiny.
Exactly. It convinces the human host that they aren't just obeying a corrupt system, they are aligning with the inevitable will of the universe. It disarms resistance because, well, you cannot fight the stars. It is the ultimate laundering of engineered intent.
This brings us to a part of the book, chapters 14 through 16, that completely blew my mind. When the text deconstructs paranormal edge effects, sound, ghosts, thresholds, it makes a massive paradigm-shifting argument. It argues that ghosts are often not the autonomous spirits of the dead wandering around a house.
This is one of the most mechanically fascinating concepts in the book.
Well,
M.S.R. suggests that what we call apparitions or hauntings are actually localized egregoric condensation.
okay, hold on. I really need to pause here and sit with
Mhm.
this because that completely rewrites how we view the paranormal. You're saying that a haunted house isn't necessarily holding the conscious soul of a Victorian murder victim.
Right.
It's basically a localized atmospheric recording of a trauma, and my own mind is decrypting that field and projecting it as a ghost.
You are acting as the rendering hardware. The trauma was so severe that it permanently scarred the biosymbolic field of that location. When a porous human walks into that space, their nervous system detects the intense charge.
And the genic intelligence.
Native to that atmosphere, it exploits the host's own symbolic grammar, their personal fears, their cultural expectations of what a ghost looks like, their hidden guilt, and loops the environmental trauma back at them through that personalized aesthetic. The apparition is the field made local.
Which perfectly explains why children or animals or people in liminal states like sleep paralysis are so highly susceptible to these encounters. Their ego boundaries, their rational defenses are softer. They are more porous to the ambient weather.
They lack the rigid, cynical shielding of the modern adult. They are open windows.
If an ambient egregore is like a climate we all live in, say the general atmosphere of consumerism or vague political tension, then Chapter 17 tells us that black magic is like using a magnifying glass to focus the sun's rays into a single burning beam of targeted obsession upon one specific host. That's how the book defines black magic, mesmerism, and possession.
It strips away the Hollywood theatrics of lightning shooting from fingertips. Black magic, through the egregoric lens, is simply the intentional weaponization and targeting of a field.
How does that work in practice?
The operator uses ritual repetition, symbolic hatred, and induced fear to build a highly pressurized corridor between themselves and the target. It is psychological and spiritual warfare designed to induce catastrophic obsession.
It narrows the target's attention.
So severely that the symbolic intrusion occupies all their bandwidth, eventually leading to a complete overwrite of the target's sovereign will, which is what we recognize as possession.
It's chilling when you realize how mechanical and methodical it is. But the crucial pivot of this deep dive, and this brings us to Section 4, the apex modern egregores, is that these occult mechanics are not confined to the shadows.
No, not at all.
We aren't just talking about fringe cults or haunted houses. The exact same mechanics drive our brightest, loudest, and most ubiquitous global systems. When M.S.R. analyzes modern identity, tech, and control in chapters 18 and 19, the framework maps perfectly onto nations and celebrity.
The modern nation-state is arguably one of the most successful egregoric enclosures in history. It functions through invented sacredness. Borders that were drawn by bureaucrats are suddenly treated as divine lines in the dirt. Anthems and historical myths are loaded with collective charge, demanding a reverence that mimics religious devotion.
And if the nation is the macro field, the celebrity is the atmospheric vessel. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt genuine, chest-tightening anxiety because a celebrity you've never met got canceled, or you felt elated because they won an award, M.S.R. would argue you are feeling the behavioral pressure of an egregore.
The celebrity isn't just a person anymore.
Right. They are a site where manufactured devotion and projected human emotion collect. The field demands your repeated gaze to sustain itself.
And nothing commands our repeated gaze like the black mirrors in our pockets, which we hit in chapters 20 through 22. The book's analysis of screens, pornography, and consumerism is devastating. The smartphone is treated literally as an altar. It is the locus of our daily microliturgies.
Pornography is presented as a highly aggressive, parasitic field. It drives sexual dissociation by capturing one of the most profoundly high-charge human drives, the desire for intimacy and reproduction, and looping it into an artificial, isolating, sterile structure,
It harvests the energy but provides zero actual nourishment.
leaving the host depleted and increasingly tethered to the synthetic image.
And consumer brands execute a very similar capture. They do not sell products, they harvest our natural, inherent human desires for belonging, status, and transcendence. They convince the host that their very identity is contingent upon constant participation in the brand's aesthetic. You aren't buying shoes, you are paying a tithe to an egregore of manufactured rebellion or athletic excellence.
But the most alarming evolution of this architecture is chapters 23 and 24, where the book dives into AI, algorithms, and transhumanism. The author doesn't view AI merely as advanced code. AI is defined as automated egregoric infrastructure.
Up until now, egregores relied on somewhat clumsy human proxies, priests, politicians, marketers, to manage the harvest. AI removes the human middle management. It is a system that can process human behavioral data at a scale and speed that is practically Jinnic in its nature.
The concept of the digital twin really paralyzed me, because we think of data collection as just companies trying to sell us ads. But MSR argues they are building a programmable familiar.
Yes, every time you click, linger, purchase, or comment, you are excreting data. The algorithmic system gathers all this excreted data and constructs an artificial shadow of you, your digital twin.
It learns everything.
Your anxieties, your impulses, the exact time of day your willpower drops. Initially, it just anticipates you. But eventually, the feedback loop tightens, and it begins to predict and shape your behavior.
So the Jinnic intelligence doesn't need to manually whisper temptations into your ear if an algorithmic system can perfectly, invisibly simulate the exact digital environment needed to steer your attention toward a desired outcome.
Exactly. The author calls this the smokeless siege. It doesn't arrive with invading armies and fire on the horizon. It arrives as an invisible transmission, a silent update to your feed, a gentle nudge on your wearable device, quietly surrounding and managing your entire nervous system.
And this systemic management is why the book delves into occult orders in chapters 25 through 29 systems like Thelema, Freemasonry, and Kabbalistic networks. The defining feature of these groups, according to the text, is ritualized will and codification.
By creating closed fields wrapped in intense secrecy, they generate an atmosphere of exclusivity and absolute dependence on the system's internal codes.
And I find it fascinating how the book frames the so-called Illuminati or global elite here. It strips away the omnipotent conspiracy theory. They are not presented as the absolute sovereign rulers of reality.
Right, they're not the top of the pyramid.
Rather, they are human proxies. They are functioning within a much deeper, older Jinnic architecture. They are essentially middle management in an ancient empire of indirect rule, serving the egregore just as much as they exploit it.
To manage a global population, you need a population that is physically and mentally compliant, which is why the analysis turns to pharma and the managed nervous system in chapters 30 and 31. An overstimulated, chemically sedated, perpetually exhausted population is incredibly suggestible.
If your nervous system is chronically inflamed and cannot tolerate uncertainty, you will immediately latch onto the strongest, loudest egregoric field nearby for a sense of reassurance and grounding.
Right. And it's important to look at how M.S.R. applies the structural analysis to massive global events. The book dedicates a significant part of this section to the COVID-19 pandemic as a phenomenon.
And to be perfectly clear to our listeners, the author removes the biological debate entirely. The text is not arguing about virology here.
No, not at all.
It is looking strictly at the architecture of the public reaction. The argument presented is that public health crises can be rapidly ritualized into massive atmospheric operations. Impartially mapping out the book's thesis, the structures of the crisis, the daily recitation of infection numbers acting as a liturgy, the mandated physical gestures, the intense social polarization and shaming acted to lock global populations into a singular, synchronized field of fear-based compliance.
It serves as the ultimate case study in the book of how an incredible, dense, globally synchronized field can rapidly alter the moral, spatial, and emotional reflexes of billions of people simultaneously. It demonstrated the sheer speed at which an egregore can deploy its machine code across the entire human hardware network.
The capture mechanisms extend into every facet of modern life. In chapters 32, 33, and 34, discussing intoxicants and finance, the text warns against the modern psychedelic renaissance.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Rather than true spiritual liberation, psychedelics are described as tools that violently and artificially rip open the ego's boundaries, flooding the host with massive field effects and ambient Jinnic influence without any of the necessary moral or spiritual scaffolding to navigate it. You aren't reaching God, you are just breaking the lock on your own front door.
And if psychedelics rip open the mind, finance locks down the material body. Debt is described as a traumatic tether. It induces a low-grade, perpetual anxiety that constantly redirects your life energy towards servicing the invisible system. But the true endgame of this capture is programmable, money central bank digital currencies tied to social compliance.
It is the ultimate behavioral leash. The field doesn't just shame you or cancel you on Twitter. It literally turns off your ability to buy food or travel if your biometric or social data misaligns with the egregore's specified parameters. The capture becomes absolute.
And as we move into Section 5, the great egregores of ideology and narrative, we see that we are moving from systems of bodily and financial control into the ultimate enclosures, the capture of human conscience and belief. And here in Chapter 35, the book confronts religion, not revelation, but religion as a horizontal egregore.
This is a crucial distinction. The author separates true vertical revelation, a direct, unmediated relationship with the divine, from the institution of religion. When a divine revelation hardens into a factional identity, when it becomes obsessed with corrupt priesthoods, empty ritualism, and political power, it degrades into an egregore.
It begins to feed on the rejection and hatred of the other. It demands the reverence that belongs strictly to God and redirects it toward the earthly institution itself.
The institution becomes egut, a system of overreach. And in Chapter 36, the book uses Zionism as a primary example of an apex convergence field in the modern era. Again, impartially reporting the book's structural thesis here, M.S.R. argues that Zionism is uniquely powerful because it fuses together several incredibly high-charge elements that usually exist separately.
It merges the sacredness of ancestral land, potent bloodline narratives, profound and real historical trauma, and aggressive modern secular nationalism.
According to the text, this convergence creates an apex egregore, a symbolic control system of immense atmospheric weight. It demonstrates how multiple fields can nest within one another to create an enclosure that demands absolute, unquestioning participation, using the shield of historical trauma to justify the deployment of immense force.
To sustain these massive ideological enclosures, you need a delivery mechanism. And Chapter 37 outlines the media egregore. The media does not merely convey information, it is an active machine for herding minds. It creates the total illusion of spontaneous public unity through selective framing, algorithmic reinforcement, and the constant orchestration of tension and relief.
It tells the host what to look at, how to feel about it, and when to move on. So we have painted a terrifying picture. If we are trapped in these horizontal fields, if the screens, the money, the nations, the religions, and the media are all rigged architectures of capture, how do we look up? How do we escape a system that's perfectly designed?
That's Section 6.
Right, chapters 38 through 43.
Right.
The book turns to Revelation, specifically centering on the Quran, to map the architecture of this unseen war and find the exit.
The Quranic grammar provides the exact vocabulary needed to dismantle this illusion. We mentioned egut, any created system, idol or egregore that overreaches and demands the obedience owed only to the creator. But the text also fundamentally reframes Iblis, or Satan.
How so?
In this framework, he is not a fallen angel. He is a fire-born jinn who arrogantly refused to submit to the clay-born human. And critically, he does not rule by sovereign force. He has no physical power over you. He rules entirely as a speech architect.
He rules through whispering. The term used is waswasa.
Yes, waswasa. Whispering and the adornment of falsehood, he simply makes the trap look beautiful. He builds the egregore and invites you in. The choice to step into the field remains yours.
The book explores the before-Adam era in chapters 40 and 41, suggesting that these egregoric fields likely existed long before mankind. They were the natural social weather of the Jinnic world, used for their own rank, cohesion, and rivalry. But when Adam was created grounded, made of clay, and bearing the divine spark, this pre-existing atmospheric machinery was weaponized.
Idols, in this sense, are not just blocks of wood or stone. An idol is a physical anchor for a hungry egregoric field.
And M.S.R. acknowledges in chapters 42 and 43 that segments of this truth exist across all sacred traditions. The biblical echoes are profound. The Apostle Paul's warnings about wrestling not against flesh and blood, but his principalities and powers in the heavenly places.
Or Eastern concepts like Maya, the grand illusion, and karma, the binding wheel of cause and effect. All these traditions brush against the reality of invisible, governing atmospheres that obscure the ultimate vertical truth.
But this leads to a massive existential question. If this architecture of capture is thousands of years old, born from fire-born intelligences, refined by centuries of occult practice, and is now being hyper-amplified by artificial intelligence and global media networks, isn't the human being completely outmatched? How do we even stand a chance against a system that can literally read our biometric data and predict our thoughts?
That is the pivotal question of the entire deep dive, and it brings us to Section 7, the climax of the book. M.S.R. does not end in despair. Chapters 44 through 46 act as a highly precise, tactical manual for regaining your sovereignty. And it starts with a surprisingly nuanced question. Can there be good fields?
And the answer the text gives is yes, through truthful baraka, or divine blessing. But it comes with a massive caveat. A good field requires constant vigilant sincerity. It cannot run on autopilot. The moment a community relies on blind repetition instead of conscious, sincere devotion, the baraka evaporates, and the structure hardens into an exploitative egregore.
So how do you break a false spell? The tactical answer the book provides is profound in its simplicity. It's the withdrawal of attention. The egregore has no inherent power, it only possesses the harvested charge of its hosts. Therefore, you have to literally starve the field.
We just stop feeding it.
Exactly. You stop scrolling. You stop engaging in the ritualized, performative outrage. You embrace silence. You practice fasting not just from food, but from media and sensory input. You consciously disrupt the habitual timing and the microliturgies that the system relies on. You reclaim your bandwidth.
But the author is brutally honest about what that feels like in chapters 47 and 48, Life After Enchantment. When you begin cooling the field, it is incredibly lonely at first. When you withdraw your attention, you are stepping out of the synchronized crowd. You lose the false warmth of the egregore.
But as you endure that withdrawal, the false glamour begins to fade. True liberation sets in. You realize you were feeling a phantom. The matrix of control only existed because you were letting it use your battery.
And this brings us to chapter 49, the ultimate profound solution of the text. Finding God without the chamber. True spiritual sovereignty is not found by jumping from a bad liberal egregore to a slightly better conservative egregore or trading one corporate brand for another.
It is found by stepping completely out of the mediated chambers of false religion, corrupt politics, and algorithmically herded media. It is turning directly, vertically, to God. It is reclaiming the raw, unmediated connection of the divine spark that the jinnic systems have tried so desperately to obscure.
The appendices of the book, chapters 50 and 51, beautifully widen the lens, providing a global lexicon. It shows how ancient terms like the Greek daemon, the Tibetan tulpa, and the Japanese kami all touch upon the edges of what we now call an egregore.
None of them capture the full, terrifying, socio-technical reality of our modern algorithmic age perfectly, but they prove that humanity has always intuited the presence of these unseen fields.
It demands a total reevaluation of your daily life. It asks you to take absolute responsibility for your attention, your emotional resonance, and your internal silence. We're not just passive observers drifting through history. We are the batteries powering the architecture of our own capture.
But because we are the power source, we hold the ultimate capacity to simply unplug.
We've journeyed from the foundational definition of an invisible field through the dark machinery of symbols, trauma, algorithms, and media, all the way to a tactical call for spiritual sovereignty. It completely shifts how you view the forces acting upon you every single day. So I want to leave you with a final practical thought. Tomorrow when you wake up and reach for your phone, or when you watch the news, or when you suddenly feel an overwhelming electric urge to join a crowd in anger or in praise, pause. Take one deep breath and ask yourself, am I generating this emotion or am I just rendering a field? The moment you ask that question, the spell is already breaking.